Hi there, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome into our video lecture. This time we're going to talk about grieving, but grieving to the next level. So if you guys have been following the class here, we know you've discovered that grieving is considered to be normal. We would expect someone to grieve after the loss of a loved one or a close friend, for example. But sometimes it can become intensified, it can be delayed, it can be prolonged, and therefore it can create some problems. So that's kind of what we're more talking about, is where it sort of reaches on beyond what we would expect. Remember, there's really no clear amount of time exactly when you're supposed to grieve for or how long. There's a lot of difference opinion on that, and it depends on different factors in terms of the ideas surrounding the death and so forth, or the information surrounding that. But in this case, we're saying is that clearly there's an issue where the person is not getting over it, or they're not dealing appropriately with the loss of whoever it is. All right, so let's get to our slides here. We'll kind of explain more as we go. So we're going to talk about something called unresolved grieving. Okay, so once again, we're saying that the grieving is going beyond what we would sort of expect, to the point where it's inhibiting the person, it's creating some kind of problem, and you'll see what I mean as we kind of go through. All right, so unresolved grieving basically means it's some sort of morbid reaction that prevents the successful conclusion of the life crisis. In other words, the person has lost someone, and rather than grieving like we would expect someone to, they take it to this sort of extreme where they can't get over it, or it creates some kind of impairment with them, or it creates some kind of problem. In other words, they're not moving on with their life appropriately. I mean, obviously it's traumatic to lose someone, but at some point you have to get up and move on and pick up your life and so forth. So in this case, we're saying the person has not done that. It's unresolved, they've not dealt with it appropriately, and it's led to some kind of issue. Now we're going to look at some different types. There's a lot of terms here. I'm going to expand on what the textbook basically says. Make sure you read that section, of course, but we are going to enrich that section of the book. And so we're going to start off with something called delayed grief, which is pretty self-explanatory. All right, so this is grief that is postponed for an inordinate amount of time. In other words, they're reacting very intensely, but the grief is postponed. In other words, it's not happening when you would expect it, meaning right after the loss of that person. It could be, you know, in some cases, it could be years later where suddenly it hits the person and they're dealing with it. So in other words, we wouldn't expect someone to delay that grieving for years in some cases. So I have an example. So there's an actual case study where this gentleman who was about, this gentleman, when he was a young boy, his grandmother committed suicide, and she was only 42. So she was a young grandmother. So obviously he was probably very little, but she was about 42 when she passed away through suicide. And it turns out that as a child, he did not react to the death of that. I mean, obviously losing a grandparent is very difficult for most people. So he did not react to it at that time. However, later down the road, he started experiencing some problems, and it turns out he was in therapy, and around age 42, he started getting these sort of feelings of depression. So in other words, we think that he had delayed his grieving process or experience until he was actually 42 himself, the age that his grandmother passed away, and that brought back those feelings where all of a sudden they resurfaced and created problems. Of course, Sigmund Freud would say that he's repressed those feelings have been repressed for several years. And then once he hit 42, there was like a trigger that would release those feelings. The point is that he was not dealing with the loss of his grandparent when it happened or shortly after. It could have been decades later, which is clearly inappropriate. So the point is that if you don't react to someone close to you dying, you could bottle up those feelings, and you could repress them, where it could come back and haunt you at a later time and create problems. So obviously we want to deal with it when it happens, so we can get over that and then heal and then move on as best we can. All right, our next type of grieving is called distorted grief. So this is where the person has lost someone and they're taking the normal symptoms and carrying them to the extreme. So this is where it gets, borderline, so sort of macabre, if you would. So this could include things like adopting behavioral traits of the deceased or aspects of the illness of the deceased. So it's very bizarre stuff here, okay? In other words, they may start acting like the person that passed away, and that's their way of sort of dealing with it. Or in some extreme cases, they may adopt certain symptoms that the person had when they were dying. In other words, it may be their way of sort of connecting to that person. So this could include things like arthritis. Maybe they never had arthritis before and it suddenly pops up when that person died because that person who died had arthritis, is what we mean by that. It could be asthma. All of a sudden they get asthma. But some of our strangest ones would be what we call psychosomatic. And what that means is that they are physical problems or symptoms which are brought about by psychological means. So in this case, we're saying it's stress. The person is so distressed by the loss of that person that their body actually manifests physical symptoms as a way of dealing and coping with the tragedy, so to speak. So there's a really classic here case study of this. So in this particular case, there was a son and his mother unfortunately had cancer, and it was a form of lymphatic cancer. And part of that was that she would develop these large boils on her neck as part of the disease. After the death, they noticed that the son, in his grieving, his whole grieving experience, started actually developing boils on his neck. Now, he didn't have cancer. He did not have that problem, but obviously it's related to his dying mother who had that, and that was his unique way of sort of dealing and coping with that. So in other words, his mind had created the physical symptoms of stress and grieving into these boils where he didn't even have the illness or the disease, which is absolutely incredible and very strange at the same time. So this could also be linked to things like depression, like severe depression. It could actually cause death. So we have some cases where the person actually passes away themselves as a reaction to the grieving. In fact, we have cases of widowers and widows experiencing that, where they die shortly after the death of their spouse because it's so traumatic to them. So the point is that the grief clearly is very intense and very distorted in some way where it could actually involve becoming like that other person. All right, so like we said, it can even cause death in some cases, unfortunately. Our next one is called complicated grief. And so in this one, the grieving is prolonged and intensified to an abnormal degree. Now remember, we said it's normal to grieve, but at some point you would have to sort of get over it if you could. And so in this case, we're saying clearly the person should have gotten over it. They're holding on to it, or something is happening where they're not letting go and they're not continuing with their life as best they can. They're sort of being held back by this grieving and so forth. So as an example of this one, you keep in mind, this could happen years later down the road. They're still grieving for this loss of person where we would expect them to have moved on. So a case study of this one, an example, is where there was a couple, an older couple, who were very happily in love. In fact, all their friends knew them and knew that they were very happy together. And as part of their marriage, every summer they had gone out to some location, some kind of vacation location, where they had a cottage that they had bought, like a summer cottage in the forest or something. And so they would spend a lot of time there together. So unfortunately, the husband's wife suddenly deceased or suddenly died, which was very traumatic to the husband because he really loved her and they had a great marriage and things going for them. And his friends started noticing that years after this, that he would disappear for long periods of time. They couldn't track him down. I don't know if this was before cell phones and that kind of thing. Anyway, his friends could not find where he was. They did not know where he was going, and they're very suspicious of it. And they knew it was probably linked to the passing of his wife. So they decided to follow him one day and they followed him, and they discovered he was going to this cottage for long periods of time, where him and his wife had so many memories, loving memories together. And when they walked inside the cottage, he had devoted the entire cottage to this living shrine devoted to his wife. Now, obviously that's very honorable and it's a great thing, but at the same time, sometimes things like that can be overboard, where it's creating you to hold on to it and to focus on it too much. So it's almost like this whole cottage was devoted to a living shrine to his deceased wife, and that was causing him to focus on it and not let go. So in other words, when you're doing things like that, it's really kind of making it worse, because you're never going to get over it if you're constantly reminding yourself. And for example, they noticed he would set her clothes out every day as if she was still living almost. So the point is that it's just getting to the point where you need to let go as best you can and try to move on with your life. And clearly he was not doing that. So what the research shows about complicated grief is that it's actually somewhat common. It happens to about 7 to 10% of people who are bereaved. So upwards to about 10% of people may experience this, which shows that, wow, that's a pretty significant amount of people. In most cases, they appear to be older and emotionally dependent on that person who passed away. So in other words, there's some kind of strong connection. In this case, we said it was a husband and wife who were very deeply in love. They also found that people who are more likely to show complicated grief tend to be neurotic, which is a personality trait. What that basically means is that these are people who have lots of anxiety, who worry about things, who are prone to things like depression. So in other words, they seem to be more prone to some of the more negative type emotions, which kind of makes sense, because it would show that they may be sort of drawn to these types of experiences, or more likely to. Okay, so once again, typically older, emotionally dependent on the deceased, and neurotic is what the studies are showing. Okay, so the consequences of this, unfortunately, besides the obvious that we've already mentioned, research is now starting to reveal that people who show complicated grief show a greater cognitive decline compared to people who go through a normal grieving process. It's not really clear what the book exactly means by that. Cognitive consequence or decline, that's a pretty broad statement, but I think that what it's showing is that the way they process information and the way they think about life may actually be affected by this experience. Maybe their ability to be sharp when thinking, you could also argue, could be connected to that. So it's not really clear what that means. They're calling it cognitive decline, but either way you look at it, it shows that there is some consequence of going through this. And so obviously we don't want people to do that. We want them to get help and be able to cope with it and deal with it at some level. All right, our last concept here, which the book also talks about, is called disenfranchised grief. So what this basically means, it's a situation where grieving is sort of unacceptable, or it's hard to sort of openly display. So grief over an unclear person or situation where it may be difficult to openly mourn for that person or acknowledge that you are mourning. In other words, it's not your typical losing of someone who, a friend or something like that. It's someone maybe you shouldn't be grieving over necessarily. So the book gives some great examples of this. That could be like in an abortion. So the person is grieving over their unborn child who they never really knew other than experiencing pregnancy. So grieving over, an embryo or fetus destroyed by an abortion. It could be like an ex-spouse, maybe someone you divorced and you're no longer in contact with, but you learn they suddenly passed away and you're sort of really feeling the loss of that person, which is understandable. I understand that. But I guess what they're saying is that when you're grieving in this sort of situation, it's kind of unexpected. It's not clear exactly what you're supposed to do. Is it appropriate? Is it not? So there's a lot of mixed feelings and controversy surrounding it. What we found in research is that this may actually worsen grief because you cannot express it. So in other words, just to kind of put it in perspective, if you were pregnant and you went through an abortion, and then you decided, okay, wow, I'm really going to grieve over the loss of this unborn child. There may be people out in the world who don't understand that. You know, why are you doing that? I can't relate in that way. It's kind of like you're grieving, but you shouldn't be, I guess, to a certain extent. And so therefore, if you can't express those feelings, at least openly in public and to people you know, you may be holding it in, and thus it's sort of magnifying the effect of that and making it worse. So it's kind of like you're grieving, you're feeling it, but you're not allowed to say so, and thus it makes it even worse in that particular case. So in some cases, this may be bottled up or maybe repressed, as Freud said, as we said earlier, and this could be bottled up for years because they felt weird about expressing it, or they didn't want people to judge them, or whatever it is. They did not express it or could not, and thus it sort of, you know, festered over time and created some massive problems. So once again, the issue there is that if you repress and bottle things up, you know, even though you're really upset about it, it has the sort of way of coming back when you least expect it or when it should not, and now you're having to cope and deal with it at a later time. And that can be tough. So hopefully, guys, this lecture has helped you to understand some of the different reactions people have to the loss of life. Remember, we're saying that grieving is a normal thing. We expect you to do that, but sometimes it can just be taken to the next level where it shouldn't be, and therefore it creates problems for the person. And so we don't want people to do that, obviously. We want them to be able to pick up and move on and live their life as best they can, even though they may have some scars and it's hard to do that, which, you know, easier said than done, obviously. All right, so hopefully you've learned a lot in this mini lecture. Please move on to the next step in the class and we'll see you online.